There are races that end cleanly, with a dominant car pulling away from the field and crossing the finish line in a manner that leaves no room for argument. And then there are races that end in a manner so chaotic, so sudden, and so loaded with implication that the sport spends weeks trying to process what actually happened and why. The 2026 Daytona 500 belongs firmly and unforgettably in the second category. What unfolded on February 15th at Daytona International Speedway was not simply a dramatic finish to the most prestigious race in American motorsport. It was a collision of circumstance, aggression, controversy, and conspiracy theory that has left the NASCAR community deeply divided and loudly vocal in a way that only the great American race can produce. Tyler Reddick won the 2026 Daytona 500. That is the official record, confirmed by NASCAR, unchallenged by any technical finding or post-race penalty. Reddick, driving for 23BMX Racing, crossed the finish line first and claimed the victory that every driver in the sport spends their career chasing. But the manner in which that victory arrived, the wreckage it emerged from, and the accusations that followed in its wake have made this particular Daytona 500 one of the most talked about and most contested finishes in the race's long and dramatic history. To understand the full scope of what happened, you cannot simply start at the final lap. The chaos that defined the closing moments of this race had roots that stretched back to laps 152 through 160, when a massive 20-car crash reshaped the entire competitive landscape of the afternoon. The trigger was contact between Justin Allgaier and the front of Denny Hamlin's car, a sudden move that set off a chain reaction of the kind that Daytona regularly and brutally produces. 20 cars. The mathematics of superspeedway carnage are always staggering, but 20 cars caught up in a single incident at racing speed is a level of destruction that changes everything about how the rest of the race unfolds. Teams that had been building their strategies around specific cars and specific partners suddenly found their plans gone, their allies eliminated, and the final laps ahead carrying a level of uncertainty that no preparation can fully address. What survived that carnage was a lead pack operating under maximum tension, every driver fully aware that the Daytona 500 trophy was within reach, and that the margin between winning and becoming another piece of wreckage was essentially non-existent. Carson Hocevar found himself at the front of that pack as the race entered its final moments, leading what appeared to be a run toward one of the most stunning Daytona 500 victories in recent memory. Hocevar is a young, aggressive competitor with the kind of raw talent that generates genuine excitement about his long-term ceiling in the sport. A Daytona 500 win at this stage of his career would have been a seismic result. And then the white flag dropped. What happened next is where this story becomes genuinely contested. Hocevar, by multiple accounts and by the evidence of what followed, appeared unaware that the white flag had been waved, signalling the final lap of the race. In the chaos and speed of a superspeedway lead pack, with drafting partners shifting and strategies evolving in real time, that kind of situational awareness gap can happen. But at Daytona, in the final lap of the 500, there is no margin for any gap of any kind. Eric Jones made contact with Hocevar, while Riley Herbst executed a blocking move on Brad Keselowski that Keselowski, in no uncertain terms, later described as aggressive and as a direct contributor to what followed. The block triggered the crash. Chase Elliott was eliminated. Brad Keselowski was eliminated. Carson Hocevar was eliminated. The front of the race became a scene of destruction and flying debris, and through that wreckage, having led only the final lap of the entire race, Tyler Reddick crossed the finish line and took the checkered flag. The immediate reaction from inside the cars and across the garage was a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and the kind of raw emotion that a Daytona 500 finish always generates, regardless of the circumstances. Brad Keselowski was not quiet about his feelings regarding Herbst's blocking move. Keselowski is a former champion who has been around long enough to know the difference between hard but fair superspeedway racing and moves that cross a line, and his assessment of what Herbst did in those final moments was pointed and direct. Carson Hocevar's frustration was palpable and entirely understandable. He had been in position to win the Daytona 500 and had the race taken from him, not by being outrun, but by circumstances that unfolded around him with devastating speed. Denny Hamlin, whose own day had been compromised by the earlier crash, offered the perspective of a man who has raced at Daytona more times than most and who understands better than almost anyone how the superspeedway environment produces exactly this kind of outcome. Hamlin's comments reflected a hard-earned acceptance that superspeedway racing is inherently chaotic, that the variables multiply exponentially as the laps wind down, and that sometimes the race does not go to the driver who was strongest or most prepared, but to the driver who happened to be in the right place when everything around them collapsed. It is a philosophy born of experience, and it does not make the result any less painful for those who were eliminated in the process. NASCAR reviewed the finish. Officials examined what happened on that final lap with the thoroughness that an event of this magnitude demands. The result of that review was unambiguous. No technical violation was found. No cheating was discovered. No penalties were issued. The result stood. Tyler Reddick won the 2026 Daytona 500 for 23-round racing, and NASCAR's official position was that the finish, however chaotic, was the product of racing and not of manipulation. NASCAR did take one additional step in the aftermath. Officials clarified procedures around the white flag, addressing the question of awareness and communication that Hochevar's situation had raised. It was not an admission of fault. It was not an acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong at an official level, but it was a recognition that the conversation around what happened needed to be addressed, and that clarity around race procedures serves everyone's interests going forward. That official clarity did essentially nothing to quiet what was happening on social media, because in the hours and days following the finish, a different kind of verdict was being rendered in the court of public online opinion, and that verdict was far less measured than anything NASCAR's review produced. Conspiracy theories spread with the velocity and reached that only the modern internet can generate. The core accusation, stated with varying levels of conviction and evidence across fan communities and social media platforms, was that 23Yanks Racing, the team co-owned by Michael Jordan, had somehow benefited from NASCAR favoritism, that the result had been manipulated, engineered, or at minimum allowed to happen in a manner that served the interests of the sport's most culturally prominent team ownership group. These claims found an audience. They spread widely. They fueled debates that stretched across racing forums, comment sections, and social media threads for days after the race. And they deserve to be addressed directly, because the gap between what the conspiracy theories claimed and what the evidence actually showed is enormous and important. There is no evidence of NASCAR manipulation in the 2026 Daytona 500 result. None. What happened on that final lap was the product of superspeedway racing, doing exactly what superspeedway racing does, which is produce sudden, violent, and completely unpredictable outcomes that elevate some cars and eliminate others in fractions of a second. The crash that cleared Reddick's path to victory was triggered by aggressive racing moves and the awareness gap that cost Hochevar his lead, not by any external force directing the outcome. The fact that the beneficiary happened to drive for a high-profile team owned by a globally famous figure does not transform a racing incident into a conspiracy. This pattern is not new in NASCAR history. Dramatic and controversial Daytona finishes have generated accusations of manipulation before, accusations that never survived contact with actual evidence. The sports fans are passionate. Their emotional investment is enormous. And when outcomes feel wrong, the search for an explanation beyond simple bad luck is a natural human response. But the history of NASCAR is filled with chaotic superspeedway finishes that produced unexpected winners through circumstances rather than design, and the 2026 Daytona 500 belongs in that tradition. Analysts and journalists who cover the sport professionally arrived at the same conclusion from multiple angles. The consensus view among experienced NASCAR observers was clear. This was one of the most chaotic Daytona finishes in recent memory. It was the direct result of the unpredictable nature of superspeedway racing, at its most compressed and intense. And the outcome, whatever one thinks of how it arrived, was legitimate. The implications of this finish extend beyond the trophy and the record books. Tyler Reddick enters the 2026 championship season with Daytona 500 momentum and the points advantage that a season-opening victory provides. The drivers who were eliminated in that final lap crash carry frustration and point deficits into the weeks ahead. NASCAR faces the ongoing challenge of managing the conversation around superspeedway racing and ensuring that the procedures surrounding finish line situations are as clear and communicable as possible. And as the series moves toward Las Vegas and the races that will begin to define the playoff picture. The question hanging over everything is whether the lessons of Daytona will prompt rule adjustments designed to reduce the kind of final lap chaos that made February 15th simultaneously thrilling and deeply controversial. The sport has always evolved in response to its most dramatic moments. What the 2026 Daytona 500 demands from that evolutionary process remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: nobody who watched those final laps will forget them anytime soon.